The Persian Gulf War, also known as the Gulf War or Operation Desert Storm, is not the most well-remembered armed conflict to take place in the Middle East, at least compared to the more recent and much longer wars being waged in Iraq and Afghanistan. Could this be because the entire ground invasion of the Gulf War, which ended with the near-total decimation of the Iraqi army, only lasted for 4 days? An equally important or perhaps more interesting question might be, what happened in the weeks leading up to the Desert Storm ground offensive to convince such an infamous hard case like Saddam Hussein to throw in the towel so quickly? Or asked in another way, what made it possible for US-led coalition forces to subdue the Iraqi army, which consisted of nearly 500,000 soldiers in approximately 100 hours, while sustaining less than 300 total casualties themselves? To arrive at the answers to these questions, we first need to take a quick look at the course of events leading up to the invasion. So here we go. On August 2nd, 1990, Iraq invades and annexes its neighbor Kuwait, taking control of the entire country shortly thereafter. Later that day, the United Nations Security Council passes Resolution 660, effectively condemning the invasion, making it crystal clear that Saddam must immediately and unconditionally withdraw all Iraqi forces, if he wants to avoid international retaliation, that is. A few weeks later, as concerns that Iraq might expand their war of aggression continue to intensify, Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney and General Norman Schwarzkopf, the commander of US forces in the Middle East, prepare to defend Saudi Arabia should the need arise, marking the beginning of what will be known as Operation Desert Shield. By the end of November, though, it's obvious that Saddam has no intention of backing down, and the UN Security Council issues Resolution 678, declaring that if Iraq hasn't withdrawn all its troops from Kuwait by the 15th of January 1991, coalition forces will use all necessary means to boot them out. The deadline of the 15th comes and goes, and on January 17th, the 42-country coalition keeps their word and begins launching continuous air and missile attacks on designated targets in Iraq and Kuwait, severely damaging or destroying Iraq's air defenses and military infrastructure. Over the next 5 weeks, the US Navy and Air Force enthusiastically showcased the advanced combat capabilities it has acquired as the Cold War was coming to an end, including stealth technology, GPS navigation, missile warning systems, advanced surveillance plane radar, and laser-guided precision bombs. So what exactly does such an impressive fighting force do with this sort of advanced weaponry? Well, with all these new weapons and technologies at their disposal, this is not going to be some point-and-shoot situation. With the US Air Force leading the way, what followed would become known as effects-based operations, or effects-based warfare, which is essentially the use of precision airstrikes to disable an enemy without completely destroying the country's infrastructure. The preliminary air attack strategy that was later incorporated into Operation Desert Storm was initially deemed Instant Thunder by the man who conceived it, Colonel John A. Warden III. Warden and his group of planners at the Pentagon incorporate a range of new air power concepts and advanced weaponry into their plan, the key objective of which is to disrupt Iraq's command and logistical systems, which he hopes will convince enemy leaders early on that a victory for them will be impossible, at least without an unacceptable loss of life. First, they intend to knock out as much artillery as they can find, seriously limiting Iraq's ability to launch chemical weapons. Then they will move on to other priority targets, including Iraq's air defense systems, large troop formations, armored vehicles, and command and control centers. A large portion of Iraq's fighting forces will also be decimated, while the country's supply lines and oil and transportation infrastructure will too be severely damaged. To make this happen, the US brings out nearly every type of fixed-wing aircraft it has in its inventory, including F-117 Nighthawk stealth bombers, B-52s, F-15 Eagles, and the low-flying A-10 Warthog. In total, the US alone flies around 40,000 air-to-ground attack missions and 50,000 support missions. So just how many bombs get dropped over the course of 40,000 missions? The quick answer is a lot. In fact, for every target that was successfully destroyed, the US dropped an average of 11 tons of guided and 44 tons of unguided munitions, equaling around 85% of the daily bomb tonnage that was dropped by the US on Germany and Japan during the height of World War II. To properly appreciate the extent of this barrage, we should keep in mind too that a number of relatively large German and Japanese cities were completely destroyed by Allied bombing campaigns. which could also be why effects-based warfare and the minimization of collateral damage were introduced from the beginning as part of the Gulf War strategy, a strategy that relied quite heavily on the use of precision-guided munitions. Also referred to as PGMs or smart bombs, these high-tech rockets were designed to hit specific targets with increased lethality, while minimizing civilian casualties and property damage. Largely making their big debut during Desert Storm, PGMs, which accounted for only 9% of air-to-ground weapons that were fired, accounted for 75% of confirmed hits. Effective, yes, but not cheap. With a price tag between $17,000 and $110,000 each, the most commonly used projectile was the AGM-65 Maverick missile, an anti-armor precision rocket originally developed in 1966 by the Hughes Aircraft Company that was eventually put into use by the US Air Force in August 1972. Also used rather unsparingly by the Air Force, but at the bargain price of only $16,000 each, were the less accurate 2,000-pound Mark 84 general-purpose penetrator bombs. Depending on the height from which they were dropped, these nearly 4-meter-long unguided bombs can blow open a crater 15 meters wide and 11 meters deep, penetrate up to 38 centimeters of metal or 3.4 meters of concrete, and can expel lethal fragmentation out to a radius of 370 meters. But not all bombs were delivered from so high in the sky. In fact, more than 4,000 GBU-12 variants of the typically unguided 500-pound Mark 82, which included a nose-mounted laser targeting system and stabilizer fins for guidance, were deployed during thousands of high-risk, low-level bombing runs. And these runs were no walk in the park. Delivering ordnance from such a low altitude not only comes with increased risk of being hit by enemy anti-aircraft weapons, but also being hit by fragmentation from the aircraft's own munitions, because the aircraft and bombs arrive on target right about the same time. That being said, not all the bombing conducted by the US was in line with their attempts at precision. Over the course of the conflict, the Air Force dropped more than 10,000 cluster bombs, technically known as CBU-87 Combined Effects Munitions, or cluster munitions. Your basic CBU-87, which stands for Cluster Bomb Unit, can be dropped from any altitude by an aircraft flying at any speed. Unlike the Mavericks or modified Mark 82s, this is a true free-falling bomb, similar to the rest of the Mark series but with one major difference, and it's a nasty one. When a typical cluster munition is dropped, it starts to spin. Then after falling to a certain altitude, the canister opens and 202 sub-munitions or bomblets, each equipped with stabilizers and an inflatable decelerator, are released. The rate of spin and the altitude at which the CBU-87 canister opens can also be adjusted, allowing the bomblets to cover a smaller or larger target area, anywhere from 20 by 20 meters to 120 by 240 meters. The higher the release altitude and faster the rate of spin, the wider the bomb pattern will be. You'd think the coalition's staggering air campaign would have done the job, but that wasn't even half of it. Also, starting on January 17th, the coalition began to hammer targets in Iraq and Kuwait with thousands of Tomahawk cruise missiles. At nearly $2 million each, these 6-meter-long rockets can be launched vertically from a ship or horizontally from a torpedo tube or external launcher mounted on a submarine. Tomahawks have a range of approximately 2,400 kilometers, can travel as fast as 885 kilometers per hour, and are reliably accurate up to about 5 meters. A few AGM-86 ALCMs are also put to use. Essentially a stealth drone, these $1 million Boeing-built subsonic air-launched cruise missiles were initially developed to increase the bombing capabilities of the Boeing B-52H Stratofortress bomber, as well as protect the larger, slower aircraft from enemy fighter jets. Despite the coalition's enthusiastic bombing efforts, a lot of invaluable surveillance was being done as well. GPS-guided bombs known as Joint Direct Attack Munitions or JDAMs did not yet exist, but GPS technology for navigation greatly improved the ability of pilots and ground forces to know exactly where they were in relation to the surrounding terrain and enemy troop movements. US aircrafts also used Ground-Moving Target Indicator and Synthetic Aperture Radar, or SAR, to monitor the battlefield day or night, regardless of the weather, and detect movement of enemy ground formations. The Iraqi forces often tried to make large-scale movements in the middle of the night, because they thought they could not be seen. No one had ever seen this level of technological advancement used in warfare before, certainly not during any previous conflicts in the Middle East. and over time, these attacks heavily damaged critical military support networks, ultimately driving Saddam and his leadership underground, greatly reducing their control over their remaining forces. Before Operation Desert Storm began, the Iraqi Air Force was the sixth largest air force in the world, but by the last week of January, the coalition has already clearly established air superiority, shooting down 22 Iraqi planes in aerial combat. As effective as they are in the sky, however, the US Air Force ends up being even more successful at destroying planes on the ground. To the surprise of both coalition and Iraqi forces, a 2,000-pound bomb dropped from a high-flying aircraft works exceptionally well for destroying both armored and underground aircraft hangars. The coalition air campaign had been going so well, in fact, Saddam reportedly began moving both military and civilian aircrafts over the border to Iran for safekeeping, in the hope of preserving them for later use if the coalition invasion continued. The coalition suspected this was what Saddam was up to, but they weren't able to prove it until after the 2003 invasion and occupation of Iraq, when the US military seized more than 100 million pages of documents and nearly 2,000 hours of audio recordings left over from Saddam's regime. In the end, they confirmed that among other jets and planes, both military and civilian, 24 Mirage F-1s, 24 Sukhoi Su-24s, 40 Su-22s, 4 Su-20s, 7 Su-25s, 12 MiG-23s, and 4 MiG-29s had been relocated to airbases and airports in Iran, many of which were happily appropriated by the Iranian government. The records uncovered in 2003 didn't reveal any definitive evidence of a secret deal with Iran to safeguard Iraq's assets. In fact, the Iranians were quite surprised when the first Iraqi aircrafts began to appear. There also seemed to be a lack of coordination between the two countries during the emergency relocation of the Iraqi Navy, from Qasr in southern Iraq to the Iranian port of Bandar-e-Khamenei, given that just 3 Iraqi Navy vessels were able to reach Iranian territorial waters without being sunk by coalition aircraft. This hasty relocation of many of Iraq's highest-value air assets, combined with the heavy losses they'd already taken, both in the air and on the ground, renders the Iraqi Air Force almost totally ineffective, leaving them with no hope of stifling the US's air campaign, which would have been their only hope of preventing what came next. Starting in early February, just 2 weeks after the coalition air campaign began, the next phase of the coalition air offensive kicks off, as the US and other coalition forces prepare for the coming invasion by focusing their attacks on Iraq's ground forces. And while this is happening, a number of US and British special operation units are preparing to slip behind enemy lines. Initially against special operations units playing any significant role in the conflict, despite the fact he would often travel with a handful of Delta Force operators as his personal security detail, General Schwarzkopf eventually relaxes his no commandos policy and gives the military's most elite soldiers and sailors the green light to do what they do best. Soon, Army Special Forces operators set up observation posts on the Saudi-Kuwaiti border and began monitoring Iraqi troop movements, while other SF teams begin conducting prisoner snatch and grab operations, with the hope of feeding valuable human intelligence back to the coalition. One team, Special Forces Operational Detachment Alpha 525, gets compromised by civilians while on a reconnaissance mission deep inside Iraq. Nearly getting overrun by the Iraqi army on several occasions, the team of hard-charging Green Berets, with a little close air support assistance, ultimately fights its way out. Army SF teams are also tasked with Foreign Internal Defense (FID) operations, or the training of allied and partner forces. A mission not as glamorous as kicking indoors for a quick snatch and grab, but FID operations contribute significantly to the overall success of the conflict, by 1. Keeping the multinational force up to speed and fighting together, and by 2. Allowing SF members to embed with partner forces and act as liaisons, mostly between coalition units and US aircraft. Among other more secretive tasks, several US Navy SEAL teams begin conducting reconnaissance operations along the coastlines of both Iraq and Kuwait, also to gather intelligence on Iraqi troop movements. They also regularly conduct visit, board, search, and seizure (VBSS) operations in the Persian Gulf, assaulting any suspicious or non-compliant vessels. But US Special Operations units are not the only ones who are getting after it. Special Air Service (SAS) and Special Boat Service (SBS) operators, the British equivalents of Delta Force and the Navy SEALs, also contribute to the unconventional aspects of the war, including a highly publicized operation to recapture the British Embassy in Kuwait City. The SAS and SBS also partnered with US forces in an operation on the outskirts of Baghdad, to disrupt or destroy the Iraqi army's underground fiber-optic communications network. An important mission, given this network is Saddam's primary means of communicating with the mobile Scud missile launchers he's positioned in the desert, most of which are armed with Soviet modernizations of the V-2, a surface-to-surface rocket developed by the Germans in the 1940s. All this, however, the bombing and missile attacks and clandestine operations, has been in preparation for the impending ground invasion, which begins in the early hours of February 24th, when a massive coalition force pours over the border of Saudi Arabia into both Iraq and Kuwait. When the signal is finally given at around 3 a.m. local time, 8 p.m. in Washington, D.C., there is a line of coalition forces stretching westward from the Persian Gulf along the Saudi-Iraqi border for nearly 480 kilometers out into the desert. Iraq's forces have already been severely weakened by the ongoing air campaign and various other operations. Poorly supplied with mostly outdated equipment, the Iraqi army is largely overwhelmed by the end of day one. Coalition forces are met with only mild resistance, taking a total of 10,000 prisoners in the early hours of the attack. When all is said and done, the number of Iraqi prisoners taken will be closer to 50,000. Priority number one, however, is establishing a forward operating base to be known as FOB Cobra, 180 kilometers over the border in Iraq. And this also in the first hours of the invasion, the coalition accomplishes with great speed and relative ease. Protected by Apache and Cobra attack helicopters, 60 Black Hawk and 40 Chinook helicopters from the 18th Airborne Corps' 18th Aviation Brigade begin by lifting the entire 1st Brigade into Iraq. And later, a total of 300 helicopters will ferry the entire 101st Airborne, 2,000 men plus equipment, vehicles and supplies, to the future site of FOB Cobra in one of the largest airborne operations in military history. By the afternoon, FOB Cobra has expanded into a major base of support for subsequent operations, as hundreds more aircraft and high-speed vehicles delivered artillery pieces, weapons, ammunition, fueling equipment, building materials, and other essential supplies. And this is where the tanks come rolling in. Along with all the other units deployed to this desert battlefield, coalition forces also send in several different tank models, the dominant one being, in terms of both sheer numbers and battlefield effectiveness, the M1A1 Abrams battle tank. In total, 1,900 of these 10-meter-long, 68-ton high-tech monsters are deployed to the desert. Designed to withstand a direct hit from an enemy tank, the Abrams also comes stock from the factory with a 120mm main gun that's gyro-stabilized for accurate firing while traversing over uneven terrain at top speed. Capable of firing armor-piercing rounds that can easily decimate an enemy tank with one shot, the Abrams is also surprisingly fast and quiet, due to its 1,500 horsepower jet turbine engine, which burns jet fuel instead of diesel. The first tanks to arrive at the staging area, however, because they're light enough to be transported by planes and air-dropped in, are the aluminium-clad M551 Sheridans. Manning their own battle tanks as they ride into Kuwait and Iraq alongside a fleet of Abrams are tankers from the US Marine Corps, mostly in M60A1 pattern models, an older tank than the Abrams but featuring a powerful 105mm main gun. Staying true to their mission, the Marines also charge from the waters of the Persian Gulf to the desert on a Hurd AAV-7 amphibious assault vehicle, a fully tracked ship-to-shore transport vehicle with a troop compartment capacity of 25. But America isn't the only country leaning on their armored division for combat support. Many of their allies are also bringing their own highly functional tanks to the battlefield in Iraq and Kuwait. For example, the 1st UK Armoured Division came rolling in with a fleet of 62-ton Challenger 1 tanks, powered by a 1,200 horsepower Rolls-Royce Condor diesel engine and equipped with a 120mm main gun. This contingent of durable and mobile Challenger 1s will wipe out more than 400 Iraqi tanks without losing one machine of their own. Armor on the Iraqi side consists primarily of Soviet-made T-72s, piloted by Saddam's elite Republican Guard. These tanks come equipped with a 125mm main gun and an 840 horsepower diesel engine. Coalition forces actually worried, at least at first, that the T-72s might be a match for their pride and joy, the Abrams, that the T-72s might have the potential to neutralize, if not dominate, their best tanks on the battlefield. This, however, does not turn out to be the case. Even with thousands of T-72s being deployed by Saddam, they are only able to destroy a total of 31 coalition tanks. Coalition forces, on the other hand, destroy more than 100 times that number of enemy tanks, an estimated 3,300 Iraqi tanks in all, through a combination of air and ground attacks in just a matter of weeks. The image most people remember of tank operations from the Gulf War is probably a fleet of M1A1s speeding across the flat desert under a glaring sun. But these shots came from military training films and were used to enhance media coverage. Throughout most of Operation Desert Sabre, the ground offensive element of Desert Storm, it was pouring down rain, often a sticky, oily mix of precipitation and the smoke billowing from Kuwait's burning oil fields, which Saddam had ordered be set ablaze. And it was against this hellish backdrop that maybe the most epic tank battle in history occurred. A raging tank-on-tank battle royale, fiercer and more deadly than any that occurred during World War II. The battle, which involved more than 3,000 tanks, plus thousands of more armored vehicles, lasts less than 36 hours and is split into 3 wild muzzle-to-muzzle shootouts, later named 73 Easting, Medina Ridge, and Fright Night, officially known as the Battle of Norfolk. The M1A1's gun range is so superior that the Iraqis' far superior numbers don't count for any advantage at all, and when the battle is over, just 6 Americans have been killed, with another 32 wounded, by a combination of enemy and friendly fire, including one incident where an M1A1 accidentally fired on and destroyed a US Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. But these are certainly not the only US casualties of this war. Things had been going exceedingly well overall for the coalition by the end of day 1. On day 2, though, February 25th, they take perhaps their biggest single hit of the conflict, when a Scud missile fired from Iraq destroys a barracks used by US troops in Khobar, Saudi Arabia, killing 28 Americans and wounding nearly 100 others. Most are members of the US Army Reserve 14th Quartermaster Detachment, a water purification unit stationed in Greensburg, Pennsylvania, that had only been in Saudi Arabia for 6 days. The following day, seeing he's clearly on the ropes and not getting away, yet without renouncing Iraq's claim on Kuwait, Saddam announces that Iraq will immediately withdraw all its forces from Kuwait. On that same day, perhaps in retaliation for the Scud attack the day before, coalition planes start dropping bombs on a huge queue of tanks, armored vehicles, trucks, and troops that has formed along the main road leading north from Kuwait to the southern Iraqi city of Basra. First disabling vehicles at the front and rear of the convoy, US bombers continue to pound the resulting traffic jam for hours. Hundreds of Iraqi troops are killed during what will come to be known as the Highway of Death incident. When asked in the following weeks about overall Iraqi casualties, neither the US nor Saudi Arabia are able to give an accurate estimate, putting the number somewhere between 20 and 100,000. The Highway of Death incident was arguably not the finest moment of the conflict for the coalition, as images of the devastation quickly surface and spread across international news outlets. The next day, February 27th, encouraged both by public outcry and the occupation of Kuwait City by US troops and other coalition forces, President George H.W. Bush decides to suspend all offensive combat operations against the Iraqi military. His conditions for the ceasefire include 1. An immediate stop to all Iraqi military aggression, including Scud missile attacks. 2. The immediate release of all coalition military prisoners and Kuwaiti civilian hostages. 3. Baghdad must comply with all UN resolutions relating to the incident. And 4. The Iraqi army must assist the coalition in locating all land and sea mines that might hinder further security operations. President Bush also invites Iraqi military commanders to meet with coalition commanders within the next 48 hours to finalize the on-the-ground details of the ceasefire. He also informs Iraqi leaders that Secretary of State James Baker would be traveling to the Middle East the following week to negotiate a long-term security plan. On February 28th, the Iraqi government announced that it will accept the UN's terms and resolutions, and on March 3rd, they signed the official ceasefire agreement, presented by General Schwarzkopf, effectively bringing an end to the Gulf War, less than a week after it officially began. What we can see clearly here, in hindsight, is that the surprise blitzkrieg-style invasion strategy used by the coalition worked as well as it reasonably could have against Iraq. By attacking with great speed and coordination, with a force consisting of both armored and mechanized infantry, as well as artillery, supported by aerial bombardment and close air support, the coalition was able to overwhelm the opposition's forces with relative ease. So why did Russia, using a very similar strategy, fail to achieve the same results when they boldly invaded Ukraine? The short answer is Russia failed in its attack because of poor planning, significant logistical problems, low combat readiness, and other deficiencies that ultimately undermined the overall effectiveness of their air, ground, cyber, and maritime operations. Putin also seems to have poorly anticipated the heroic level of Ukrainian resistance and the amount of operational, technical, logistical, and financial aid that would come pouring in from the West. One of the biggest problems for Russia presented itself right from the start, during their initial push toward Kyiv, in the form of logistical issues and a breakdown of effective command and control. It was immediately difficult for Russian troops to operate in the contested urban areas inside Ukraine, and without access to railroad transport, Russia's ground forces weren't able to move fuel, munitions, spare parts, or equipment up to its forward-deployed units. During Desert Storm, the coalition solved this problem on day one by airlifting an entire brigade, and later a whole division, into Iraq and establishing FOB Cobra. After that, they could move troops, vehicles, and supplies as they pleased all over the country. Coalition forces during Desert Storm 2 were not relying on the element of surprise, and had been using airstrikes to soften up Iraq's defense for weeks leading up to the ground invasion. Russia, on the other hand, failed to achieve air superiority, largely because they underestimated Ukraine's air defense capabilities, which had recently been bolstered, in part, by Western aid. Russia's attempt to use airstrikes to weaken Ukraine's air and ground defenses was also largely ineffective, even after launching more than 1,100 missiles at Ukrainian military and civilian targets during the first 3 weeks of their attack. After this first 3 weeks too, the Russian Air Force began running out of precision-guided munitions such as laser and satellite-guided bombs, forcing them to rely more heavily on unguided artillery shells, rockets, and missiles deployed by their ground forces. The ground attack itself was also planned and executed based on Putin's bad assumptions about 1. The effectiveness of the Ukrainian military, 2. How the Ukrainian people would respond, and 3. How the modern Western world was going to react to an obvious war of aggression. Poor planning and execution also contributed to roughly a dozen Russian generals and other senior officials getting killed on the battlefield quite early on in the conflict. Also, unlike the Iraqi forces in the Gulf War, the Ukrainian military has turned out to be a much more formidable opponent than Russia expected, not to mention the enthusiastically hostile response from much of Ukraine's civilian population. Facing a capable and aggressive opposition at every turn, Russia's undersized invasion force failed to achieve many of its crucial objectives, one of the most detrimental being their failure to secure Ukraine's western border, which would have largely prevented the supply of foreign aid, including weapons, military equipment, and fuel. For the initial invasion of Ukraine, Russia deployed between 150 and 190,000 soldiers. In comparison, when the coalition invaded Iraq and Kuwait, they had a force of nearly 1 million. Ukraine's military also turned out to be highly effective at using anti-armor munitions. So even though some Russian armored units were able to push into Kyiv suburbs only 48 hours into the war, many of these units found themselves cut off from all support, far ahead of the Russian force's main body. Spread out like this, the Russian army found themselves incapable of providing security to logistics and support vehicles carrying much-needed food, water, medical supplies, fuel, engineers, and spare parts to forward-deployed units. Many Russian vehicles simply broke down and had to be abandoned because there were no spare parts or mechanics available to fix them. Repeated logistical breakdowns and strategic failures ultimately led to demoralizing casualty rates for Russian ground troops, as well as the partial or complete destruction of at least 1,000 battle tanks, 350 pieces of artillery, 36 fixed-wing aircraft, and 50 helicopters. Another problem for the Russians was, although they tried, they could not achieve a technological advantage over Ukraine. Even though Russian intelligence agencies utilized a number of electronic warfare tactics, including cyber attacks targeting hundreds of Ukrainian government and infrastructure systems, these attacks had minimal impact on Ukraine's ability to fight or communicate. Russia's goal was likely to undermine Ukraine's political will, weaken their ability to fight and collect intelligence, but by using an aggressive cyber defense, along with some help from Western governments, private companies, including Microsoft and SpaceX, and a range of other state and non-state actors, Ukraine was able to deflect or diminish most of the cyber attacks waged against them. As we discussed earlier, the effective utilization of technology on the field of battle was, arguably, the most significant advantage the coalition had during Desert Storm. But what do you think? How is technology changing conventional warfare? What are some of the most important lessons we can learn from both the Gulf War and Russia's war with Ukraine? What do these lessons suggest about the future of the war? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe if you want plenty more military news, history, and expert analysis.